Good evening, everyone. We might get started as the amount of people rolling in is starting to slow. So welcome to this book launch event for distinguished Professor John Braithwaite's new monograph, Macrocriminology and Freedom. I'm Kate Henne, the director of RegNet, the School of Regulation and Global Governance, here at the Australian National University, and I'm absolutely delighted to see so many colleagues joining us for this discussion of John's latest work. Before we begin the proceedings, I'd like to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands on which we are meeting today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm on Ngunnawal Ngambri country, but I know some of you are joining us from lands near and far. And in acknowledging and paying respect to the continuing cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, we as a school recognize their strength, resilience, and enduring connections to the lands of this continent. I also want to extend that respect to First Nations colleagues who are on the call today. Now, before I introduce the man who inspired this event, I should go over some housekeeping items first. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and your name and voice will also be recorded and visible to others who listen to this after it's been recorded. Later on in the session, you'll have an opportunity for Q&A. So we're going to ask that you use the raise your hand feature if you have a question or comment at that time. And if you're on social media, you can jump onto Twitter and tweet live by using the handle @ANUREGNet. So that's @ANURegnet. So I think that's all the housekeeping we need for now. Everyone's pretty accustomed to Zoom, and we are in kind of an open Zoom format to facilitate discussion. So let me introduce our author. John Braithwaite is currently Emeritus Professor and is the founder of RegNet. Over his career at the ANU as distinguished professor, he has achieved eminent standing in the social sciences. He is the author of 27 books, and John, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. Is this 28 or 27? I lose count. And so does John, apparently. He's also edited 7 collections and has written or co-written nearly 200 refereed journal articles. He's recognized as one of the world's most influential scholars in both criminology and socio-legal studies. His expansive research agenda has advanced knowledge across a range of issues, and some of them, just to give a flavor, include corporate crime, delinquency, global business regulation, peace building, Republican social theory, responsive regulation, and restorative justice. That said, I think it's important to note that John's work is not limited to his scholarship. His engagement with ideas extends well into work with civil society, government, and social movements as well. He is actively engaged in the peace movement, the politics of development, the social movement for restorative justice, the labor movement, and the consumer movement, among others, in Australia and internationally for 50 years. As many know, John has received a wide range of awards and fellowships for his work, including 2 Australian Research Council Federation fellowships. And if I were to list that full range of awards, we wouldn't have time for the panel this evening. So I'll just mention a few right now. They include the Future Justice Prize for Extraordinary Work in Justice and Peace Building, the Stockholm Prize in Criminology for Lifetime Contributions to the field, and the Law and Society's highest award, the Calvin Prize. While these many achievements attest to John's standing in the fields that he works in, I want to end my introduction by focusing on his values and the book we're discussing this evening. John is perhaps just as well known for his generosity of spirit as he is for his many groundbreaking books. He's a tireless champion of justice as non-domination in all areas of life, and I'm sure we'll discuss that more with our panel and what we mean by that. The commitments shine through this text of macrocriminology and freedom. And in fact, you can see them in all 814 pages of the book, including the references. And I'm sure many of us will hold it up for others to see, but it's worth checking out. In each of them, John prompts us to think with him about how different forms of criminological knowledge and non-criminological knowledge can help us make sense of the core challenges we are facing globally. The text itself illuminates the value of deeply and critically engaging fundamental questions about crime and its control. And for those that are in the field of criminology, they'll know there are deeper debates about that I'm sure our panelists will discuss. In terms of approach, John knits together a reflexive yet forward-looking analysis that pulls on a range of theoretical perspectives, macro-level observations, decades of empirical insights, as well as autoethnographic reflections. His strong Republican commitments underpin a central argument about building and supporting institutions, as well as approaches that maximize freedom, and he discusses how crime prevention can support those efforts to reduce domination and vice versa. Now, of course, that's only part of the story, which is why it's worth reading the book. And with that preview, I should turn it over to our speakers, who will share many more details and insights than I can here. This evening's session will proceed with each panelist speaking for about 10 minutes, followed by a short reflection from John, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. We also have something very special for John, or at least I think it's very special for John, at the end of the event, so please feel free to stay on if you can. Like you, I am very much looking forward to being in the audience for this great event, and I will now hand it over to Professor Miranda Forsythe, a dear colleague here at RegNet, who will introduce the panel and facilitate the discussion.
Thanks so much, Kate, and welcome everybody for tonight's exciting discussion. So you'll see from our lineup of panelists what a wide-ranging book it is. Was such a choice really of people to ask to talk on the topic. And so I'm really delighted that we've got really a whole range of perspectives, from criminology through to law, consideration about what does macro versus micro theorizing mean, political science approaches, and so forth. So we will, I'll introduce each speaker individually, and then they will give their comments, and then I'll introduce the next speaker. So turning first of all to our first speaker, who is Professor Susanne Karstedt. Delighted that you're able to join us on Zoom, unfortunately not in person, but this way of having the event at least has enabled a broader participation from people all across the globe. So I think we've got people from so many different countries who are joining us today. Professor Susanne Karstedt is a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University, where she's been since 2015. She's the author of, I think, about 20 books, and well known for her work on the ways in which democracy shapes violence, corruption, state crime, and prison conditions. She's also very well known for her work on atrocity crimes and transitional justice. So Susanne is the real leading criminologist amongst the panel, that we're really looking forward to your reflections on the book.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and thank you also for inviting me to this really wonderful event. And it's a pleasure to be here and also to celebrate this book. So welcome to Macrocriminology. John Braithwaite always surprises us criminologists, and I'm one, with ideas that we are not used to, connections that we rarely make, and visions that are beyond our horizon. But this is how he has shaped our field as no one else in this generation of criminologists. And obviously, as he confesses in this volume, he sees himself as one of those. I think not always the case. So this weighty tome is no exception to this. It includes all the surprising and mind-changing turns and twists for which John is known and for which we like his work. As I'm belonging to this crowd of criminologists, my focus is on the macrocriminology part of the title and less on the freedom part. What is macrocriminology, and how will it shape our field? What does it mean, thinking like a macrocriminologist? Given the fact that John once wanted to abolish criminology as we know it altogether and to make it part of an encompassing science of regulation, this is the first, and for a criminologist, very welcome surprise. Macrocriminology is about, and these are his words, reframing, reshaping criminology, mapping out a bigger vision for criminologists, but not about abandoning it. And the next surprise, his focus is on crime, on patterns of crime and criminalized states, markets, and institutions. As he writes, the theory of crime and freedom is a general theory and a macro theory. And this is a very powerful statement in our field, where macrocriminologists are preoccupied very much with punishment and criminal justice institutions, and others want to subsume crime within a harm concept. So thank you, John, for being a traditionalist with a powerful vision for the core of our endeavors and our future. However, always good for turns and twists, John's second concept in the title, freedom, now is actually a shift towards justice, which is the other part of criminology's business. Freedom in relation to crime means freedom from domination that has the potential to reduce, temper, restrict, or prevent crime. This indeed now includes the dominating power of criminal justice institutions that so often gets out of hand, is unnecessary, and causes great harm. So freedom from domination is as much on crime, but it also gives us a future for envisioning criminal justice. And there are lots of chapters in the book which relate actually to this. Criminal justice institutions are also the institutions where and through which the criminalized state, as John terms it, commits its most atrocious and heinous crimes. So John wants a revolution that sees criminology, and these are his words, sees criminology as a bad idea when it focuses on criminal justice institutions. True, John, I admit that. But also in your book, you convince me that such a revolution might be possible by analyzing criminal justice institutions through the lens of domination or the tempering of domination. Notably, in this area, domination by communities can be as bad as by the state, and that is mentioned in a number of chapters. And as a German, I'm well aware of this. Next, criminology is a discipline that is inherently normative, both on crime, what is a crime, that is normative, and how do we do justice, that goes deep to our values. So the old Kantian question, about which Kant himself said, the interests of my reason, theoretical as well as practical, John, boil down to just three questions. What can I know? What ought I do? And what can I hope for? And these are embedded, at least the first two, are embedded in our research on crime and justice. None of the two comes without deep normative questions. And John's work, and in particular in this volume, he brings this constitutive characteristic of our discipline to the fore, to serve. And this is, and these are again his own words. So he argues for concepts that are both explanatory and normative, and as such, and these are his own words, equipped to serve in both roles to support a political vision and a transformed institutional arrangements. Freedom from domination is the pivotal concept here, and each of these chapters combines this here explanatory rigor with normative arguments in this macrocriminology vision for future criminology. And I think this is one of the biggest achievements here. This constitutive characteristic, as John also notes, of our discipline and the tensions it generates between the explanatory and the normative, make criminology, and this is what he says, an inherently dangerous game. Actually, it can be life-threatening. Nearly the same words were used by the criminologist who was also the first to coin the term macrocriminology. This was Herbert Jäger in 1960s Germany. So in his previous work on crime under totalitarian rule, Herbert Jäger, a young German criminologist, delivered a brilliant analysis of state crime and the lawless state of the Nazi regime, John's criminalized state. His analysis, and these are the words of Herbert Jäger, of the inherent perils of our professional mindset, which he originally applied to the doctors who orchestrated the murder of disabled men, women, and children, also applies to criminologists under the Nazi regime. They set up and participated in policies that transformed institutional tasks from general prevention of crime to racial general prevention. And criminologists were involved in transferring young and adult offenders to concentration camps or to psychiatric wards, where the majority were murdered in camps by exploitation, hunger, and neglect. So John's macrocriminology is a wake-up call here to think about these dangers that criminology runs into when we lose our moral compass. Not many of you might know that Thomas Scheff's review of John's 1989 book, which established him, as we all know, Crime, Shame, and Reintegration, had the title A New Durkheim. Macrocriminology and freedom suggests another towering figure, of course, Max Weber. However, I can assure you there is a huge difference between John and Max Weber. John is one of the best, vivid, and accessible writers in our field. Max Weber, unfortunately, is very, very boring. So I can recommend each of John's 12 chapters to you, and you will enjoy amazing insights, a tour de force through history, and mind-changing examples and cases. Only not all chapters at once, I would recommend. So many congratulations, dear John.
Thank you so much, Susanne. And John has got a right of reply, but not until the end. So hold those thoughts. We're now going to turn to Jensen Sass, who is a Braithwaite Fellow here at the School of Regulation and Global Governance, RegNet, at the ANU. So it's appropriate that you have the name Braithwaite in your position title, Jensen. Jensen is also, like all of our panelists, really an interdisciplinary scholar with many different interests, particularly focusing on political deliberation and also corporate power and democratic politics. So Jensen, over to you for your discussion.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Miranda, and thanks, John. Well, it's an honour to be able to speak about John's book tonight, but it's actually a funny kind of honour, or a funny kind of privilege, in that I was speaking to a colleague a few weeks ago. Actually, it was Miranda, and I realised through conversation pretty quickly that there were pretty low odds that I was going to be able to say something this evening about John's book that John hasn't already thought about, and likely that he hasn't written about, and even more likely that he hasn't written about more compellingly than I might say it. So a good outcome for me tonight, I think, is to remind John of something that he'd been thinking about at some point, and maybe to provoke some discussion about it again. Okay, so I'd like to say just something general about theory to begin with. And theory doesn't merely answer questions, it provides us with frames of reference in terms of which we can ask questions. And the best theories help us ask important questions, and they give us enough guidance and they suggest enough plausibility that we're both capable and motivated to start answering those questions. Great theories, I think, in addition to all of this, are compelling. Once we've been exposed to them, they work their magic on us, and sometimes they take hold of our vision, for better or worse. So across page after page, and indeed chapter after chapter of Macrocriminology and Freedom, we see the magic of theory at work, not least in the defining move of treating crime in the first instance as the effect of a certain pattern or malformation of macro-societal normative order. The magic of this particular theory depends on a vast range of reference, and it's only in light of extremely diverse applications across societies and across history that this kind of theory can be developed and demonstrated. And the demonstration is powerful. And is often as well, is frequent as well. As one example, what begins as a personal aside, I think, about John's family history, about the intergenerational consequences of military service within family, then expands and allows to build upwards in the proposition of a really striking explanation about the rise of crime in the latter half of the 20th century. Namely, that the rise of crime can be traced back to the trauma experienced by the grandparents of the perpetrators. As John put it, or as John indicated, there might be a causal force in 4 decades of war that are wading through the grandchildren's blood. An explanation of this kind would not be available to a social scientist whose focus was micro or more standardly disciplinary. While war might be conceived as a kind of crime, certain wars are crimes, and while all manner of crime is conducted within war, war itself typically stands well outside the causal vision of standard explanations of crime that's undertaken within peaceful and prosperous societies. Outside of the circus, we need to be aware and be careful with magic. Theory allows us to see in new ways, but we also have to examine whether what it helps us see is actually real. We need to adopt, I think, a pragmatic and experimental stance towards theory, and especially those theories that attract us. And I think this ethic is demonstrated and encouraged in Macrocriminology and Freedom, which exhibits a rare, not rare for John, but otherwise rare combination of bold macro-level conceptual reformulation and an almost positivistic mindset there's a constant search for sites, data, and hypotheses that will allow for the testing, revising, extending of the theory. To John's proposition that war might wade in our blood for generations, we can point to interesting additional forms of evidence, including a growing body of epigenetic research that demonstrates precisely what John suggests, that trauma experienced in one generation is indeed passed on, and that it affects the cortisol production, among other biochemicals, and so one's capacity to handle stressful circumstances. The legacy of war may well indeed be in our blood. As Susanne indicated, 30 years ago, Thomas Sheff, who was a doyen of American sociology, announced that the new Durkheim had arrived and that his name was John Braithwaite. No greater compliment could be made of a social scientist who developed a general theory of crime that aimed to support a normative vision of the good society. If John lost his head back then, and he justifiably might have done so, he evidently found it again. Were John a less humble person, I think he might have given this book a more grandiose title. A candidate for that would have been Crime, Freedom and Society. After all, this isn't merely a book that explains the entanglement of crime and freedom. It's a book whose central arguments depend on an original theory of society. Well, what is society anyway? Sport, religion, art, government, everything and nothing. There's a certain kind of social scientist who would ask that immediately. But society in John's work means something quite specific. It comprises that core set of differentiated institutions whose proper functioning is necessary for achieving human well-being under modern conditions. And as John points out, if well-known traditions of social theory or political theory have prioritized one of these institutional domains over the others, the state over the market in socialism, the market over the state in libertarianism, and I'd add civil society over market and state in anarchism, in John's Republican theory of society, which he developed with Philip Pettit and Martin Krieger, among others, there's no institutional domain that finds priority. Rather, their functional contributions are recognized and pathways to calibrating the operation are sought in their mutual checking and balancing. In a sense, ordinary people have actually already landed on that insight. So in democratic countries, we have parties of the state and we have parties of the market, and voters switch between these, perhaps partly in response to the recognition that one institutional domain had been prioritized for too long. Has the market become too dominant? Has the state grown too interventionist? These are the kinds of questions that people indirectly ask when they vote. But there's no need for us to leave judgments about the balancing process to this somewhat ad hoc process. So balancing can be the object of social scientific investigation. And it's for that reason that in addition to offering a conceptually precise theory of society, John's theory can and must also be testable, or at least it must yield testable propositions which we can evaluate so we can refine its capacity to guide our practical judgments. For John, as for Durkheim, social progress cannot be reduced to maximising the function of any one of these institutional domains. Social progress can't be reduced to maximising economic growth, because Durkheim shows us not only personal economic loss, but also sudden economic gain can be ruinous. Indeed, it is predictive of suicide. Braithwaite shows us that there are markets for vice as well as for virtue, that they each can drive economic growth. But in this book, Braithwaite takes us beyond Durkheim, however, in explaining the sources of macro-social integration. Determining the right balance in the scope and powers of institutional domains is not to be achieved by creating a science of society that, once perfected, becomes a technocratic science of state. Rather, balance is fostered by an institutional realm that Durkheim had not quite put his finger on, civil society. The scope and power of state and market institutions is to be regulated by civil society, which becomes a crucial domain for the articulation of moral visions of the good society. The intellectual and practical challenge for social scientists and everyone else is to determine how to fashion what we might call civil power, that distinctive form of power that allows civil society to regulate states and markets. Civil society doesn't operate according to bureaucratic control or market incentives. Its members act on their own volition and according to their own priorities. And this relative freedom from vertical commands and financial rewards has often been seen as a source of the institutional weakness of civil society. To be sure, a small group of courageous people can achieve a lot, and perhaps they can achieve anything, but there's no guarantee that this group will appear when a society needs them. Indeed, they often appear not before, but in the wake of catastrophe, or at least that's when their influence is greatest. In Macrocriminology and Freedom, however, we see some suggestions of institutional innovation that might overcome this problem. By dint of Braithwaite's broad historical range, his discussion of Sun Yat-sen's vision of a fifth branch of government responsible for accountability and integrity, and potentially led by ordinary citizens, that civil society might begin to overcome the problem of collective action, or more specifically, the problem of timely collective action. An institution of this kind promises to expand civil power. Indeed, if for the last few decades we've witnessed the overextension of market institutions, we're now witnessing the return of the state, a development which necessitates the fashioning for new concepts and institutions that will extend the countervailing force of civil society, which, among other things, will be needed to defend market institutions. On the methodology on display here, and Susan touched on this, I have a small comment. Macrocriminology and Freedom was achieved via the masterful integration of normative and explanatory theories. As Braithwaite put it, normative theory without explanatory theory can be empty, and explanatory theory without normative theory can be blind. But a slightly perhaps sharper or more direct formulation of this, and Susan has talked about this, is to suggest that normative theory without explanatory theory can be empty, and explanatory theory without normative theory can be blind, and further, it can lack explanatory power. What John demonstrates in this book is that we don't only care about truth, justice, and solidarity because we are good-minded people. We care about them because we are social scientists and because they matter in a causal sense. Just as anime disempowers, truth, justice, and solidarity increase a society's collective efficacy. That is, the capacity of a society to achieve things in which its members find value. Collective efficacy depends on reducing the quantum of domination in a society, just as reducing domination depends on collective efficacy. Macrocriminology and Freedom is a guide to achieve both of these aims. Of course, the guide is incomplete. It awaits refinement, testing, extension, and practical application. And that is the work, vaster even than John's book, that lies before us. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jensen, and some of your earlier remarks on the way in which John likes to put out his theories and then welcomes critiques makes me remember the many occasions when John has seemed to be absolutely delighted by the fact that something has emerged that has proven that he was wrong about something that he had initially thought, and yes, has then been able to refine his theory with such joy that it's always been impressive to me. So turning now to Professor Meredith Rossner, who is a Professor of Criminology at the Centre for Social Research and Methods at the Australian National University as well. So she joined us about 2 years ago from the London School of Economics, and her work really focuses on restorative justice, emotions, rituals, and the built and more recently the virtual justice environment and the way in which, for example, online court hearings are occurring. So Meredith, over to you.
Thank you so much. think that maybe I was invited onto this panel because I'm the microcriminologist, and I look forward to kind of riffing on the relationship between micro and macro. Yes, what a special day, and what a pleasure to be here and to see everyone here. I know it was a shame to move it onto Zoom, but it's also a real bonus to see all these lovely faces from people all around the world that are dialing in to celebrate John and this great work. I just want to briefly start by thanking Miranda, you for really driving this event, and also Kate Henne, Mai Fu, and Julia Wee, who are all kind of making this happen in the background. Thank you for bringing us together tonight. Also, both Anthea and Jensen and Kate and Miranda and John are all from RegNet. I'm at the ANU, but I'm not from RegNet. I'm from the Center for Social Research and Methods. And I think it's worth acknowledging that this is one reason this is special is this is a really RegNet event. RegNet as an institution, as Kate said, was founded by John and Val Braithwaite many decades ago. And it's exactly the kind of place where this type of work, this type of scholarship flourishes. RegNet scholars have always been unafraid to both engage deeply with real world struggles and to produce some of the best scholarship that's truly interdisciplinary and potentially transformative in its scope. John, you note that this book is the culmination of a life's work. I would also add that it's a powerful representation of what RegNet is and the kind of work that it can support. I also want to take a moment to personally thank John for decades of support and inspiration. He has supported me and countless others. I would suspect probably almost all 81 people in this room tonight. I first met John years and years ago, at the same time I met Susanne, in fact, in 2004, when I was a PhD student, feeling very nervous and out of my depth at a conference and intimidated by everyone around me. John was extraordinarily kind and attentive then, as he continues to be today. My interactions over the years have inspired me to emulate this both in my personal and professional life, however imperfectly, and really be guided by the values of kindness, openness, generosity. And I would add that this is an approach to scholarship and to scholarly life that I find most rewarding. And I thank you, John, for being such a role model in this regard. So Susanna and Jensen, I'm also going to talk about Tom Sheff because what a title, The New Durkheim. I mean, John, how did you feel when you first read that in 1990? But in this 1990 review of Crime, Shame, and Reintegration, Tom wonders if John is a new Durkheim. And he makes that comparison because of the masterful way in that book, John applied sociological theory to make sense of cross-national statistics about crime, much like Durkheim did in Suicide, right? And because of John's ability to move between the micro, meso, and macro scales. So as we all know, what Crime, Shame, and Reintegration taught us all those decades ago was that in order to maintain social order, there needs to be an institutional means to both reward good behavior and shame bad behavior. And through a series of examples, John shows us how through acts of reintegration, both pride and solidarity are cultivated, both on micro and meso levels. And at the end of that review, Sheff asks, how can we build solidarity on a global scale? What kind of state and global institutions are up to that task? He considers perhaps the United Nations, but that's not good enough. To quote Sheff, he argues that institution is so organized that the member governments seek to preserve current national and international orders rather than develop new ones, something that's in the news right now, right, in terms of what the United Nations can and can't do. Sheff riffs on the idea of a new global institution, kind of like the Olympics or the Nobel Prize Committee, that might build community or build shared moral orders amongst nations and help promote the beginning of an international social order. Arguably, although both Susanna and Jensen says that John's taking a step away from Durkheim, I don't see that at all. I think that what Sheff sees in John's famous treatise on crime, shame, and reintegration is actually the potential for macrocriminology and freedom, which is where we are today, 33 years on. So a new Durkheim indeed. This book argues that the key to social order is freedom, not just thin liberal freedom in terms of the rights of an individual to make their own choices, but a thick Republican freedom that is respectful, inclusive, and intolerant of all forms of domination. This book is a revival of and celebration of anomie theories. John brings together Durkheimian ideas about anomie and normative orders, so the anomie ancienne, and the American structural and institutional theories of anomie, so a la Merton, Messner, and Rosenfield, and so on, what he calls anomie américaine, to make a very powerful case for a macro-level social theory of institutions. A key argument of his book is that the road to freedom is paved with a tempered balance of strong institutions. So what does that mean for crime? In terms of crime, he argues, if we reframe crime as a form or an act of domination or unfreedom, then strong and just institution building should be a core thing that criminologists care about. So there's a lot to turn over in these 800 pages, and that's going to require many weeks, months, and years of reading, thinking, and discussing. And yet at the same time, and I hope for those of you who haven't read it yet, but who've heard from our speakers, there's a real simplicity and elegance to these ideas that I think are really, really compelling. So for instance, freedom as an organizing principle. One reason that freedom is such a useful concept here is that it works on both macro, micro, and meso levels. Indeed, this book is called Macrocriminology and Freedom. But I suspect, and I understand this is really clunky, and this is why you didn't do it, John, but it could be called Micro, Meso, Macro Criminology and Freedom. Or in fact, as you suggest one point following Giddens, Micro, Meso, Macro, Meso, Micro Criminology and Freedom, about moving upwards and downwards back to scale. So the challenge for us as scholars or activist scholars is to figure out how to move up and down that scale in an ethical way. Second, freedom as an organizing concept moves criminology away from a preoccupation with explanatory theories. This is kind of the meat and potatoes of what we sort of are often taught criminology is, and reminds us that theory building is best when it's both normative and explanatory. And that's something that both Susanne and Jensen have both discussed in depth. And I think it's worth mentioning here for folks in the room who aren't as familiar with the discipline of criminology, that's actually quite a radical step for many criminologists. And I would argue that's one that's most welcome. Third, about freedom as an organizing concept, there's an infinite capacity for freedom, right? Freedom is not a zero-sum concept. And I would point to some of the most moving moments in this book is where you discuss collective efficacy or freedom promoting solidarity and the way that can cascade in positive ways. And I think that you end with this kind of criminology of hope that I find most moving. So in what remains of my time, I'm just going to offer 3 really small comments on this work to encourage discussion afterwards, or John, for you to think about in your own time. My first point is methodological. You make the argument that criminologists need to move beyond microcriminology, which you define as trying to predict when an individual offender will commit crime. But it's also clear that you value other forms of microcriminology. And indeed, my reading of it is that that's quite central to your theory. In particular, I'm thinking of the microcriminology of someone like Irving Goffman, for example, who would urge us to focus on encounters rather than on individuals. And in Braithwaite's imagining, I would suggest we can empirically examine encounters in terms of how they promote domination or freedom. Or of course, as you mentioned in the book, the microcriminology of Robert Sampson and colleagues. And indeed, collective efficacy is a micro level concept that you spin out into macro levels throughout your book. So given this, I wonder if you could tell us more about the links between the micro and the macro, or the macro and the micro. How do we go up and down that scale? You clearly value all methods and are interdisciplinary in your approach, but you also seem to privilege the deep understanding that qualitative and ethnographic work can bring. So to quote you, you say macrocriminology is fundamentally dependent on qualitative work that connects events in very local spaces to global spaces, and historical work that is both fine-grained in its focus on critical junctures and of wide sweeps across history across the entire planet. My question is, how does one draw on micro methods, so ethnographic methods, qualitative methods, or historiography, to build macro theory? How do we do this honestly and ethically when arguably macro level explanatory variables can never actually be substantiated with ethnographic data, which following folks like Jack Katz, I would suggest, is at its best provides a detailed study of situated interactions. I think, John, that your concept of freedom as both an explanatory and normative variable that works across multiple levels is instructive here, but I think this area is ripe for more discussion and experimentation for how we actually operationalize this methodologically. My second comment is about current events. So the publication of this book in 2022 at the same time as the current war in Ukraine seems eerie, as so many of the ideas explored in this book are immediately relevant to understanding Ukrainian, Russian, European, and indeed global normative orders of the past, present, and future. I know that you have also recently published an editorial drawing on some of these ideas to suggest some restorative ways forward in this conflict. And reading this book at the same time as watching events unfold over the past few weeks, I can't help but think about how you might imagine the relationship between anomie, cascades of crime and domination, but also cascades of collective efficacy and solidarity. So I want to thank you for offering both a micro and macro lens through which to understand this current conflict. And I would certainly love to hear any more thoughts you have on this. I'll just end on a really brief comment about collaboration and mentorship. As you mentioned many times throughout this book, you're deeply influenced by many of your collaborators. In particular, the collaboration with your friend and colleague Philip Pettit has been a rich and fulfilling scholarly and personal journey for both of you, I would imagine. You're also, of course, profoundly influenced and inspired by your partnership with Val Braithwaite. And there are ways, as you say in the book, that two people are writing this book who are tightly, lovingly bound. And I think that's just a really wonderful phrase. A second source of inspiration and illumination for you are your relationships that you've had with your many students over the years. Much of the work that informs this book is based on collaborations with students and former students, some of whom you have pointed out have expanded your view, changed your mind, etc. And as Miranda points out, it's lovely how you talk about how pleased you are to have your mind changed by some of your students, by some of your PhD students. And this generosity as a scholar, this openness to new people, to new ideas, to new changes, is one of the hallmarks of your approach. And it's part of what has allowed you to tackle such big ideas with such grace. And I wonder if there's time at the end to offer any reflections a bit about how this approach to collaboration has shaped your work, your methods, and indeed your ideas. I think I'll end with that. Thank you so much for this wonderful work.
Thanks so much, Meredith. Thanks very much for those personal reflections as well. And I think that's what we wanted to also have in this event that goes from the sort of the global to the very personal, is the opportunity for us all to share our real appreciation for the human characteristics of John as well, and of Val, who I can now see coming into the screen. So our last speaker is Professor Anthea Roberts at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at RegNet. I'm here at the ANU.
Hi. I have another.
Anthea is also a polymath, an interdisciplinary scholar whose work crosses many different domains, largely in the field of global governance and geoeconomics. She is the director of the Centre for International Governance and Justice here at RegNet and chairs the ANU working group on geoeconomics. And I think it's appropriate that we'll go from the sort of the more micro focus, I'm sure, to a more macro focus with Anthea.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much for organising this. It's a really wonderful event and I'm really pleased to be a part of it. So thank you, everybody. I was going to start off by saying that I'm probably the oddest duck on the panel because I'm not a criminologist and I'm not a sociologist. And so I'd have probably done better at this book if you just called it Macro by Braithwaite. So I'm going to focus on the macro part and link it actually a bit to a number of the points that Meredith made about the micro to meso to macro. So I want to address two different things today. The first one is to talk a little bit about scholarly DNA and the macro approach. And the second is to focus in on one of your very powerful metaphors that you use in this book, and also your Cascades of Violence book, which is Cascades, and give a sense of how this can cascade into other areas as well. So let me start with DNA. I'm always really interested in what is the sort of signature DNA of a particular scholar. And I think of this often very much through artistic journeys, that you can really see certain paintings and you know immediately that they're a Vermeer or that they're a Van Gogh, but you can also see somebody's scholarly or artistic approach kind of change over time. So I love, for example, self-portraits of artists that start very dark and conventionally, and then by the end are much lighter and more colorful, and you can really see them coming into their own. And there is a real element of that, I think, that you can see in John's work here, that he's synthesizing all of the work from so many different years and becoming very colorful in the process, and really showing this scholarly DNA that has this very, very strong macro element to it. And Meredith is quite right. It's not just macro. It is very much a zooming of micro to meso to macro, macro to meso to micro. That's incredibly unusual. And in a way, John, I want us to say you're sort of modeling something which many, many people desire, and yet there are so many things in the academy at the moment that are sort of making it much less likely that we get the next John Braithwaite. And so there is an element to which I think you're really standing for something here of showing the importance of this kind of scholarship. What I see, something that kind of connects a lot of your work in the past, is not just a sort of a deep interest in the micro to the macro, but also a pushing against and a frustration with disciplinary boundaries and silos, and many of the compartmentalization that we see, and a really strong sense that if you want to understand some of these phenomena, you can't hold everything equal and just look at a particular level or in a particular discipline. You necessarily need to move at different scales and move across different disciplines and put ideas together. And I think that this is something that has really been a part of your interest in kind of tense rather than rigid boundaries, in a sort of reaction against ordinary science modes of academia, which are sort of how can we kind of prove things in a really rigorous way, to how our approach to that kind of desire for rigor can actually lead to rigor mortis in our fields, and to things being too cloistered or too contained. And there's really a movement here, I think, towards something which doesn't just do ordinary science, but does some of that paradigm shifting work that comes with that ability to do macro vision. And it made me sort of really have questions about how we instill this in a new generation, how we teach it, how do we incentivize it? In your case, I think you model it, you also mentor it, but how do we even have language about it? So we hear a lot, for example, about the importance of really kind of nailing down a particular question and absolutely proving it. But what's the value, and how do we talk about and how do we teach not the nail it approach, but the sketch large phenomena or sketch emerging phenomena approach? We do a lot in our methods classes often to really make sure that people are good at all of the fine detailing, but how do we teach them to step back and to look for the big picture or the evolving picture? How do we teach zooming? How do we teach moving around? And it's a really interesting thing that you obviously model it here. And I think you would also, with Val, in creating RegNet, have sort of embodied it for a generation, sort of passing it on to others. So I wanted to sort of say, there's an element to which here in your and Val's creation of RegNet, I can say kind of personally as a scholar, it's been a life-changing ability to come into this environment in terms of how it's sort of broken down the walls and allowed a different kind of scholarship. But it's also been one where I've really seen the strong nature of your mentoring, and here in particular, because of a long friendship with Miranda, I've seen the extraordinary close personal and professional role that you have played in her life, and how incredibly rich that has been. And it's made me really think that you as a scholar, and I've struggled with the metaphor for it, and I don't have the right metaphor for it, but in a way, when you do this big macro re-theorizing work, this non-ordinary science work, in some ways you function like a platform scholar, where you actually create a whole platform that so many other people can come on afterwards. In some ways, you function like somebody who is a gardener of a beautiful set of garden beds. And instead of coming and saying, this is my one perfect orchid, or John, in your case, my 27 perfect orchids, you've actually created a garden that has allowed so many other types of plants to flourish and to grow and to interweave with each other. And that also made me think, we've been doing a lot of reading in some of our complexity work on how forests are not just so incredibly interconnected, but are often held together by what they think of as the mother trees. And those mother trees create shade and also nutrients, and others come along their sap lines. And if you'll forgive the very gendered nature of it, John, I think that you and Val have really functioned as the mother tree for RegNet and for a whole generations of scholars after you. And that's something incredibly important in terms of building a diverse ecosystem and allowing different things at different heights and scales to thrive. Now, while we're on not quite nailing the metaphors and mixing the metaphors, I wanted to go to one of the metaphors that's very prevalent in your book, and it's very prevalent in this book, and I see Bina da Costa is also online. It's prevalent in your book of Cascades of Violence, which is obviously Cascades. And I wanted to give you some sense of how it is your ideas cascade well outside criminology and well outside sociology. So as you probably know, Miranda and I for a long time have been going for jogs in the morning. Meredith now joins us on many of the jogs. Jensen has been on some of the works with us too, but refuses to jog. And one of the things that we often do in this is we talk about many things, and John, your name is often on people's lips, including from Miranda, who is swearing about the fact that whatever our latest discovery has been, she then finds 20 years ago in one of your papers, but we will forgive you for that. And just to give you a sense of how this works out, so in the last week, I was reading this book on, and particularly focusing on cascades, because I've been doing a lot of work in geoeconomics and also in risk, in thinking about like how different kinds of risks cascade or have exponential effects and how you intervene in those. So I was reading your book and thinking, this is incredibly interesting to look at how you have phenomena of cascades, which you say spread and multiply. But I was also looking at Miranda's book proposal on her work about how sorcery accusation related violence in Papua New Guinea was spreading like wildfire, and how can you control it? And it made me really think that at the moment, the way that you're using cascades is a broad metaphor about multiplication and spread, but you apply it to a lot of different phenomena. So you apply it to illnesses, you apply it to crime like wildfire, you also apply it to hotspots by policing and by ink spots. And it really struck me from the work I was doing that we could pass this more. And I guess the way I would say it is, why is it that ink spots don't spread like wildfire? Okay, and the reason that ink spots don't spread like wildfire, even though both of them spread, is that ink spots tend to spread in a more linear way, in a more controlled and a more measured way. Whereas wildfire tends to have this exponential quality to it, something which, as we've seen very much not just in the wildfires in Australia, but also with COVID, that you get these exponential growths of R over one, and then it sort of takes off in these exponential ways. And it made me think that there's a difference between those exponential spreads and those linear spreads. And quite often when we're dealing with really harmful phenomena, be it wildfires or COVID or types of crime, many of them have these exponential qualities of wildfire, and yet many of our methods of intervention have the linear quality of ink spots. And so that made me think, how do you fight wildfire with ink spots? If you think about fighting wildfire with water and you bring water to bear, water doesn't multiply in the same way as fire multiplies. So how do we bring these two things to bear? And it occurred to me that your idea of hotspots, it's not that hotspots themselves multiply by like wildfire, or that they're exponential in that way, but by targeting interventions in this way, we can actually flip something from exponential growth to exponential decay. So we don't actually need the ink spot itself or the hotspot itself to be an exponential phenomenon, because most things that humans can do to intervene will be linear. But what we often need to do is do enough intervention at critical points that we turn something from exponential growth into exponential decay. And so I think that there could be really interesting ways that this plays out in a variety of next generation scholarship here at RegNet. And I think, for example, beautifully in the work that Miranda is doing at the moment about sorcery accusation related violence, about how you fight that kind of wildfire with linear methods like firefighting with water. I'll just end by saying that your use of metaphors I find incredibly inspiring, because I often think that when you're trying to push this next generation of work and you're trying to get people to think in different ways, that metaphors are really powerful for opening up new visions and new approaches. And so I really loved that. But also one of the things we know from sort of our approaches to complexity science is that in most linear environments and in most of the ways that we're taught at university, we're always taught, don't mix your metaphors. Whereas actually one of the things you do beautifully, and one of the things that the complexity approaches encourages us to do, is to mix our metaphors. So with that, I've given you planting, I've given you forests, I've given you gardens, I've given you platforms, I've given you artists, I've given you cascades, fires and ink spots. There's been a lot of mixing of metaphors, but that's because there is so much fertility in your thought. Thank you for being our mother tree.
So much, Anthea. What a beautiful image, the mother tree. So I'd like to hand over now to you, John, for some reflections on what's been said so far.
Well, thank you kindly. I guess our mother tree is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri country on which we speak and share our thoughts, and I acknowledge the elders in that way. Thank you first, Kate, as well, for your generous introduction. I'm so grateful to you and to the university for the wonderful support it's given me over many decades. And I'm so proud to publish with ANU Press with its visionary open access model. Now, tomorrow there's a celebration of the 1000th ANU Press open access book, and this one happens to be the 1000, so people can attend that event as well if you're not booked out by then. And thanks to ANU, all of ANU Press's editors, the editorial board members, referees, ANU colleagues who contributed helpful ideas and comments on the book, including, yes, members of my family, to whom I do, as the book says, owe that deeper debt. Well, particular thanks to you, Miranda, for organising such a wonderful team of people to comment, and to Susanne, Jensen, Meredith, Anthea, for such thoughtful and evocative comments, which I can't possibly cover. I have all sorts of bits of paper here, wondering depending on which bits I might use, but I will reflect deeply upon all of them and seek to integrate them into future work. Criminology is a field with a lot of practical people in it who focus on particularities and practicalities more than I do. In that sense, I see myself as a criminologist more like Dr. Watson and not like Sherlock Holmes in the story. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson went on a camping trip. After sharing a good meal, they retired to their tent for the night. In the early hours of the morning, Holmes nudged Watson and asked, "Watson, look up into the sky and tell me what you see." Watson said, "I see millions of stars." Holmes asks, "And what does that tell you?" Watson replies, "Astronomically, it tells me there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Horologically, it tells me that it's about 3 in the morning. Theologically, it tells me God is great. Meteorologically, it tells me that we'll have a beautiful day tomorrow. What does it tell you, Holmes?" Holmes rests silent for a moment and then speaks. "What it tells me, Watson, is that someone has stolen our tent." I won't try to go through all the things that you've raised, but I guess a couple of you did ask questions that I should answer, and then we'll flip over to the audience. I hope there's time to answer some questions, to ask some questions. Meredith asked the micro, macro, meso question, and you know, the macrocriminology focus is really about saying it's a neglect. I actually think criminology is a bit too much like Sherlock Holmes and not enough like Watson. I'm committed to Watson in that regard. That the macro corrective is important, but how do we draw them together? Meredith's question, a very big question. I try to do it in some practical ways throughout, but I actually recently had a conversation with Jensen about deliberative democracy and its place. What sort of mix institutionally do you have between representative democracy and deliberative democracy? And I think there is a place for things like deliberative polling, but you know, Jensen works on deliberative democracy among other things. And I'm going to refer in a minute to the climate change debate and relate it to tax policy work that comes up in the book. And I think it might come up in the book about the considerable tax redesign that was occurring in Australia in the 1980s. And in that time, I was serving on the Economic Planning Advisory Council, which was chaired by Prime Minister Hawke. And I wasn't particularly a Bob Hawke fan as a political leader, but he had a great gift as a chair of involving everyone deliberatively in the conversation in a way that something came of it. And what we were doing in the stage of the council deliberation that led into the National Tax Summit of 1985 was the view was that there should be a diversification of the tax base so that certain tax rates could come down, but there would be more different kinds of taxes at lower rates so that there would be less incentive to cheat in the tax system. And the sense at that time was that there was a big problem of tax avoidance and evasion. So one of the new forms of tax that was under consideration was a wealth tax. A capital gains tax was being supported on the council by Paul Keating, and it was the capital gains tax that particularly survived the debate. But we were having a debate about a variety of options, and one of the things I was advocating was a tax on carbon. Hawke was quite dismissive of the tax on carbon idea, but it wasn't a stupid idea to float, because Ross Garnaut was his economic advisor at that time. And I tried it again when Keating took over as Prime Minister, and by then Bruce Chapman was Keating's economic advisor. So I sent all this stuff over from Stern and climate economists to ask them to think about it. And again, Keating seemed unimpressed with the idea, but when we found 20 years after the cabinet meetings that occurred at that time, the release of the cabinet papers 20 years later, it turned out that they actually did discuss it in the cabinet way back then, more than 30 years ago, and there was almost majority support around the cabinet table. I've written a paper that's discussed in this book in the Law and Society Review called The Limits of Economism in Controlling Harmful Corporate Conduct. It advocates taxes on environmental harm, but argued that economic models of the optimal level of carbon prices are always going to be profoundly wrong because the incentives for carbon fraud so high. And that was passed back then in 1981 when that was published, that was partly based on empirical experience of experiments with enterprise level environmental taxes in the former communist economies of Europe. Now, when we had the conversation about all this stuff in the council of 16 members, this was the micro deliberative bit about a very macro restructuring of the Australian economy, and it was very connected to the debates about privatisation and the character of regulation at that time. You know, the tax changes were probably more macro than any have ever been made. Michael Davidson, the president of the National Farmers Federation, spoke up and said, well, my concern is that the effectiveness of Australian agriculture is based on extensive agriculture. You know, the average size of family farms in Australia is many times higher than the average size of family farms in all other countries. And some of these proposals that you're tossing round in your willy-nilly deliberative way, they're great risks in the way they will interact with each other, so that what we might end up in is a situation where if the parents who are the owners of the family farm die, the children may have no choice but to split it up in order to pay their tax liabilities, and that might reduce the scale-based efficiency of Australian agriculture. And here's the micro deliberative point about how you try to get the macro better. So Hawke turned to the National Farmers Federation president and said, well, Michael, could you come back to us and we'll have a genuine discussion. I want you to accept that my government went to the 1983 election with a commitment to the people that we would restructure the tax base in some way like this, so that we're likely to do this. But I want you to come back with your thinking on what would be the way to design it to do least damage to Australian family farms and to the character of Australian agriculture. And it was very impressive to see his micro deliberative work in that way. So you can't do the macro well without doing the micro well. I agree with Jensen. I'll only deal with, so many great thoughts from the panel. I'll only deal with those who ask specific questions. Anthea specifically asked about distinguishing between ink spots that spread and wildfires that spread. Well, in Bina da Costa and my book, Cascades of Violence, we see the ink spot spreading as being conceptually different in the sense of being spreading of non-violence, which is a spreading which has a healing edge, whereas the spreading of violence is a cutting edge kind of spreading of violence begetting violence. So both violence begets violence as it spread, but non-violence begets more non-violence and spreads out across a countryside with good kinds of deliberative practices, which, of course, people like Meredith and I would say, and Miranda would say, are restorative. But that's the way I would think about that distinction. Okay, now I'll say a bit more about one of the things I was thinking of mentioning was that the IPCC report on mitigation of climate change was released yesterday. And so the question I'm asking here now is, why does this book persist after, 41 years after that Law and Society review piece on that goes to taxes on carbon? Why do I persist with urging young criminologists to empirical work on carbon fraud? what I advocate in the book there has no resonance at all with yesterday's IPCC report. If you search the report with every key word in the criminological lexicon, fraud, crime, criminal, police, prosecutor, you find no criminology of any kind. The only word search that takes you close is greenwashing. In passing in 11 places, the report says that critics say greenwashing could be an issue. More or less, that's all it says. IPCC is mandated to provide a summary of the best science, but only one reference to greenwashing mentions empirical evidence on the incidence or impact of greenwashing. Here's what it says. A report on post-issuance green bond impact reporting notes that despite concerns, greenwashing incidence is rare. Let me repeat that the only evidence-based conclusion on greenwashing in the report, greenwashing incidence is rare. It then goes on to the cited evidence. Greenwashing is rare, with 77% of green bond issuers reporting on allocation and 59% reporting on impact. So the fact that bond issuers report that there's an impact is evidence that an impact has occurred and has not been greenwashed. That's like believing us when we report our impacts to the ARC. When prices on carbon have been introduced in other countries, their impact has been disappointing. What yesterday's report says about that is, by 2020, over 20% of global emissions were covered by carbon taxes or emissions trading systems, although coverage and prices have been insufficient to achieve deep reductions. And then, you know, they have these confidence. So that's medium confidence. Not an upbeat policy inference compared to others in which there's high or very high confidence. It oversimplifies to say that with higher carbon prices, there would have been deep reductions because of this complexity. The higher the price, the stronger the incentives for carbon fraud. The effect sizes in the meta-analyses are still low when the prices are highest. At another point, the report says, however, economic theory suggests that carbon pricing policies are on the whole more cost-effective than regulations at reducing emissions. I'd say that the evidence, as opposed to the theory that's cited, reveals many forms of regulation are more cost-effective. These include diverse regulatory means that RegNet folk have studied across the 22 years of our existence. So please don't be discouraged because many of the things you've worked on, they were there in the fine print yesterday. Once you wade through the 3,000 words, they're there as really effective with genuine evidence of their effectiveness. Among them is technology forcing, as by delicensing of coal-fired plants, corporate capital punishment, as the criminologist would say, corporate capital punishment for those that fail to close them voluntarily, banning internal combustion vehicles by announced dates, enforced, I might hope, with criminal prosecution of car dealers who sell gas guzzlers after that date. So yes, Susanne, viva criminology, but also viva regulatory theory. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, John. I think you actually just gave us a work through example of how you connect the micro to the macro in real time. So I'm pleased that we've recorded that because I think we've got a great illustration there. So now I would very much like to open up the floor to questions. We've got about 20 minutes or so. So if you could put up your hands, if you can, put your video on and ask your question directly. If there's any reason that you can't do that, then feel free to type it in the chat and I'll ask it out loud for you. We need some brave soul to go first. Thank you very much, Professor Lacey. And thank
Hello,
you for
everyone.
joining us. I'm sure it's late where you are.
No, it's very early where I am, and I'm not
really
really at the linguistic stage yet, but I can't resist just coming in. I don't really have a question because I think we've had a really, really rich discussion, but I just want to add my voice to those who've celebrated John and Val and this amazing work of sort of energy and hope and optimism. And I just salute your optimism, John. Somehow you managed to do that without being unrealistic. You know, your steadfast sort of courage and looking forward, and it's made such a difference to my own outlook and career. And it's just been a huge privilege to know you and Val, and I only wish I could actually be there today.
Thank you, Nikki. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see so many of you out there, I should say.
Okay, well, I don't have anybody raising their hand. So then can I ask you a question, John, which was provoked also by the idea about the connection between these different levels. And that is, and I suppose also comes from the way in which you started with a story. How do stories play that role? Or do you see stories as being important in playing that role of connecting those different levels?
Yeah, I think stories are generative, including generative of the macro. And that's what I was trying to do with the Bob Hawke story, telling a story about being a good deliberative chair with transformation of a democracy, the character of a democracy. Yes, it's a representative democracy, but as Bob Wooden says, first deliberate, then vote. So we, you know, all democracies are some kinds of hybrids of, you know, some courts are more deliberative than others. Other courts, they don't sit around the table and have long conversations about the case. They go off to their rooms and write their independent opinions on the case. So this is the example of a key variable telling a story, such as that Bob Hawke story. So it can be a tough hooker, and certainly was one who I did not admire in certain ways, but you can find how there's a deliberative essence in the micro, and then rethink how an institution like the Economic Planning Advisory Council, with all the obligations we had in those days of the different kind of democracy that existed in Australia, then to go out and consult with the different constituencies that were our particular jobs to represent on the council.
Thanks, John. Anthea?
Sure. So I just wanted to come in on the question of connecting the micro to the macro. So one thing that both John and Meredith agreed on was you needed to be strong on the micro in order to do the macro. And I think there's truth to that, but I also think there are some limits to that. So one of the things we were tossing around between us this morning when we were trying to think of artists that you reminded us of, John, and you can agree or disagree with these ones, is I said you reminded me more of Van Gogh than you reminded me of Vermeer. So Vermeer has incredible detail to like just the shine on the pearl and the earring and every part of the tapestry. Whereas there's something to me about Van Gogh that kind of steps back a little bit more, is a bit more impressionistic. It's not totally divorced from reality. It's still very much based on reality, but there's almost an element as you see his better work where if you zoomed right in it, and same with Pontola stuff, and you looked at all of the stuff in the self-portraits, he's got like bright purple here and bright orange here. And like, if you go into the detail, he's wrong on some of the detail, right? Like that's just not what it looks like on the detail. And yet in the macro, what he's creating is an amazing thing. And I'm not saying that you're wrong in the details here and right in the macro, but it seems to me that it's not just the case that you have to be really good on the micro and then you pan out telescope by telescope scope and then you just see something higher. There's often something else going on, and sometimes it's not that there's something that you create in a macro that can actually be not 100% right in the micro and yet create something really valuable. And I think the other thing about that is that no one can do this kind of macro theory at the macro level and be a Vermeer level detail on every element of the micro. It's just not possible. So if we want a methodology that allows us to do the macro, it sort of needs to have some touching points to the micro, but it can't have that level of expectation, or else no one can do it. And so that made me think about this book, which I just got off the shelf, which is a global ethnography of the mushroom, and the mushroom as it's done through sort of international trade. And it makes this point that you can't do that ethnography of every single part of the mushroom trade, but you can kind of more sporadically come in and sketch in these sorts of ways. So I just think, I haven't worked out how to describe it yet, but I think to me, it's not just a telescoping down and telescoping up, that these things kind of move at different levels with different styles and in different ways, and they need like different ways of assessing them rather than, and that doesn't mean that we don't need some micro detailing in it, but the macro isn't just an aggregation of the micro.
To me, the artistic genre is more pointilliste in a way that connects to Miranda's question, in that what it's seeking to do is take a lot of stories from very different times and places and dot them on the canvas in some sort of pattern. And of course, when you do that, you're right, Anthea. I mean, you get all sorts of details wrong because you might have done serious field work on some of your dot points. I have on some of mine, but others of them just were so important to, make the connection that I undoubtedly have done a shabby job on some of them, and there are terrible mistakes there. But you see that in the work of a lot of other people, including Tom Sheff, like, when just to create a bit of resonance with what Susanne has to say, Tom's very much a micro sociologist, as you said also, Meredith, so that he would take a text like Hitler's Mein Kampf and he would, diagnose the micro dynamics. So, he takes bits of text and reaches the conclusion that Hitler in Mein Kampf is livid with shame and rage. Shame about things that happened in World War I and rage at those who he perceived as responsible for what happened to the German people in World War I. So he has that very micro grounded way of doing social science that again create World War II is as big a macro transformation as the world has ever seen in the terms of this book, which sees wars as really important and leaving impacts for a very long time.
Thanks, John.
I know what sort of painter I am after all that, though. I can't paint at all.
Miranda said Jackson Pollock, and I said you weren't Jackson Pollock.
I like Jackson Pollock. Maybe I'd like to be a Jackson Pollock. Yeah.
So we also, Anthea has got a follow-up question, but I'm going to ask Bill. You had a question. Bill says that his video may have paused, so he might have difficulty, in which case I'll ask it. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, there we go.
How's that?
Great.
Yeah, thanks, John. Just I printed this. I've read chapter 12 and the appendix, which is about as much as I got into in the last couple of days that I've had to read it. I actually wrote to Andrew Hastie a couple of years ago and I said, do we need to just treat war as a form of crime, like not really knowing anything about your work at the time. And then I wrote to some guys in America as well, some ex-special forces people and complexity people. And that's really my question with regards to Peter Dutton, the idea of having an ex-cop in defence. I'd be interested in your thoughts on him in that position. Thanks.
Well, I'm certainly even less of a fan of Peter Dutton than Bob Hawke. But I think I do kind of believe in the concept of crime. I do think that crime does useful work. So if you take a very practical war crime issue, it's inevitable that there are going to be wars. And if there are going to be wars, it's inevitable that there are going to be prisoners of war. And it's so important to make those distinctions in the Geneva Conventions between ways of treating prisoners of war that are crimes against humanity and ways of treating them that are decent, a decent way of succumbing to the reality that unfortunately you've captured these people and you have to do something with them other than shooting them or torturing them for intelligence. All the way through, I'm inclined to that view. It's part of what Susanne was talking about, this coming to the conclusion that whether it's in terms of the IPCC report or in thinking about Ukraine and war crimes, the crime concept does some useful work. It's not to say that the criminological lens is the best lens or the regulatory theory lens is the best lens, but it has value as a lens, I would say, so long as it doesn't become a discipline, because I don't think it goes so well as a discipline, as I think the same way about most or all of the social science disciplines. Actually, the way the social sciences is organised is a total disaster. One of the things we're about in RegNet is breaking out of that disaster in new and creative ways.
Thanks, John. I'm slightly concerned about the idea that our tents might be stolen from us as well, though, but probably you would like to come in and rip up people's tents so they would have to go and construct new tents and run into other people's tents in the middle of the night as well. So we've got to 6:30. I'm not going to call for any more questions, but I'd like to thank very much all of our panelists for your great insights and comments. As John said, I think it's given us all a lot of food for thought.